In February of 1951, the Tennessee General Assembly passed a law about two roads. It was not a famous law. It concerned Highway 71 and Highway 73, two stretches of asphalt running up into the Smoky Mountains. The law handed them to the federal government. Buried inside it was one clause, that any conveyance made pursuant to this act shall provide that no toll or license fee shall ever be imposed by the United States or any agency thereof for the use by the public of state highways number 71 and 73. Ever. 75 years later, Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in the United States. More than 12 million recreation visits in 2024, roughly twice the second-place park, and it is not allowed to charge a single one of them to come in. Not because of a budget decision, not because of a policy preference, because of a sentence written in 1951, and a federal law that bars an entrance fee anywhere tolls are prohibited on a park's primary roads. 12 million people a year arrive at a gate that is legally forbidden to take their money. That money did not evaporate, it went somewhere. It went about 2 miles down the mountain, into a town of roughly 4,000 permanent residents, which has spent 90 years building one of the most concentrated tourism economies in the American South on a single fact: the thing everybody drove here to see does not cost anything. This is how one sentence built Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And it begins with the people who were removed to make the park possible. Because the reason the park is free is that they are the ones who paid for it. Before it was Gatlinburg, it was White Oak Flats. The Ogle family settled this valley in the early 1800s. The story the town still tells is of a widow who came south with her children to finish a homestead her husband had found and never lived to build. For decades, it stayed White Oak Flats. It took the name Gatlinburg in the mid-1800s from a man who ran the general store and got the post office put in it. Understand what this place was. It was not poor by its own reckoning, and it was not empty. It was a working mountain community, families who had held the same coves for 4 and 5 generations, who buried their dead in family plots on the ridges, who ran mills and churches and schools. There were hundreds of communities like it across these mountains. And in the 1920s, a group of businessmen in Knoxville and Asheville decided that all of it should become a national park. Here is the thing most people never learn about Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Yellowstone was carved out of land the federal government already held. Yosemite the same. The great western parks were drawn on public ground. The Smokies were not. This land was owned, every ridge of it, by timber companies and by families. To build the park, somebody had to take it. More than 6,600 occupied tracts of land were acquired for the establishment of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Occupied, not empty. 6,600 places where somebody lived. The Park Service's own administrative history puts the human number plainly. Roughly 6,000 residents were forced to sell and vacate their homes. Both the states and the federal government had to use the power of eminent domain to get it done. The scale is hard to picture, so the history gives you a comparison. The land they assembled runs to more than 500,000 acres, about half the size of Rhode Island. 85% of it belonged to logging companies. The other 15% was more than 1,000 farms. It took 3 acts of Congress, an authorizing act in 1926, an establishing act in 1934, and a supplemental act in 1938 to help finish buying the land. And it took money that the 2 states did not have. North Carolina passed a $2 million bond issue in February 1927. 10 weeks later, Tennessee passed $1.5 million. Add a little over $1 million raised from private donors, and the 2 states had a fund of nearly $5 million to buy a national park with. It was not enough, so the Park Service went to find a rich man. In May of 1927, Assistant Director Arno Kammerer began courting John the 500th Rockefeller Jr. On the 4th of August, he met Rockefeller in person and handed him a briefcase full of photographs of the Smokies. 8 days later, he wrote to him at his summer house in Seal Harbor, Maine, and made the ask. The Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial gave $5 million The administrative history calls it critical in making the park possible. So hold the two numbers next to each other. Two states scraped together nearly 5 million. One family in New York matched all of it with a single gift, and 6,000 people lost their homes. Some families were allowed to sell and lease their homes back, living on as lifetime leaseholders. The terms were hard, the rent was real, and there was almost no way left to earn a living inside a park. Most of them left anyway. And there is a second removal that gets folded into the first, wrongly. So let us separate them. In 1943, a separate agreement brought the Tennessee Valley Authority into these mountains for the Fontana Dam. TVA condemned private holdings, including upland ground above the waterline, that was destined for the park. Landowners challenged whether TVA could take land that would never be flooded. The Supreme Court said it could. TVA forced some 1,311 families to leave. 16 cemeteries were subject to condemnation and removal. That figure belongs to TVA and to Fontana. It is not the park's founding number, and you will see the two added together all over the internet. They are different takings in different decades by different agencies. What matters is the total weight of it. Thousands of people were moved off this land so that tens of millions could visit it. They knew what they had given, and when it came time to decide whether visitors would be charged at the gate, that is precisely what they said. The fight over whether to charge admission to the Smokies ran for more than 15 years, and the National Park Service lost it. The Park Service wanted control of Newfound Gap Road. The states would hand it over on one condition: no tolls, not now, not later. The administrative history records the position both states took, and it is worth hearing in full. Both states took the position that their citizens had already given so much for the park that it should be a free public space for them for all time. For all time. That is not a bureaucratic compromise, that is compensation. The free gate is the receipt for 6,600 occupied tracts. The Park Service's own director, Arno Kammerer, was sympathetic, and the history is specific about why. He knew them. He had, in its words, befriended many of the Tennesseans and North Carolinians who vacated their homes or gave generously of their wealth. Others inside the agency were not sympathetic at all, and the reason was arithmetic. The administrative history states it without decoration. With each passing decade, however, one thing became more certain. If entrance fees were charged to the millions of people who visited Great Smoky Mountains each year, the fees would bring in a whopping amount of revenue. They knew exactly what they were giving up. It came to a head in 1948. A Park Service assistant director stood up at a gathering in Gatlinburg and floated a fee for the Clingman's Dome Road. The response was immediate, and a man named Frank Maloney wrote to the director with an inconvenient piece of history that the original rights-of-way for the road from Gatlinburg to Newfound Gap had carried a provision that the road should be forever toll-free. The Park Service dropped it. 3 years later, the Tennessee legislature made it permanent, and a regional director summarized the surrender in one line: "It would be best to accept what now may be possible and leave improvements to future legislation." There were no future improvements. The sentence held, and 2 miles down the mountain, a town was watching all of this very closely. Gatlinburg had been getting ready. The new Mountain View Hotel opened in 1918, run by a man named Andrew Jackson Huff. Andy Huff, who the Park Service's own history describes as a great friend of the park. His son Jack built LeConte Lodge up on the mountain in 1925. The road came through in 1932. The park was established in 1934. Franklin Roosevelt dedicated in 1940. And Gatlinburg found itself standing at the entrance to what would become the most visited national park in America, holding the only thing inside 100 miles that the park could not provide: a bed, a meal, and something to buy. The park cannot charge you. Gatlinburg can charge you for everything else. That is the whole business model. It has never changed. Everything that follows is only the scale of it, and it worked immediately. The park's own master plan expected around 3.5 million visitors a year by 1965. Visitation blew past that in 1960, when an estimated 4.5 million people came through. 4.5 million people, 5 years ahead of schedule, arriving at a gate that could not charge them a cent, and driving straight through a town that could. Gatlinburg did not sit there waiting to be a service area. It built a product. A writer counted the gift shops on the Parkway in the mid-1950s and stopped at 50. 50 gift shops in a town of a few thousand people. They sold the mountains back to you. Handmade pottery, mountain jewelry, quilts and patterns called sunflower, Dutch doll, tulip, double wedding ring, loomed tablecloths and aprons. A shop on Roaring Fork Road called the Wood Whittlers took furniture orders. At Stalcup's Laurelwood shop, you could watch bees make honey and carry home a jar labeled sourwood or buckwheat or wildflower. That magazine piece made an observation in 1954 that has never stopped being true. The town's appeal, it said, had less to do with the wilderness of the Smokies, which made a handsome backdrop at least, than with the town's brilliant merchandising. A handsome backdrop. And then the National Park Service's own history delivers the line this entire episode is built around. For increasing numbers of tourists, shopping in Gatlinburg was the essence of a trip to the Smokies. Some never set foot in the park. Some never set foot in the park. That was written about the 1950s. 70 years ago, the thing had already inverted. The park was the reason people drove here, and the town was the reason they stayed, and a growing number of them never walked on the ground that the 6,600 families had been removed from. After the war, it accelerated, and the Park Service watched it happen from the other side of a boundary line it had no power over. Its own administrative history describes the result. This is the National Park Service in an official document on the town at its front door. There was little the Park Service could do as the booming tourism economy produced such eyesores as the 500-foot-tall Space Needle in the center of Gatlinburg and the aerial tramway that crosses over the Gatlinburg bypass, eyesores in the official history. And it was not only an opinion, the Park Service tried to stop it. Superintendent Fry argued the aerial tramway needed a right-of-way because it passed over the Parkway. He was overruled by his own director, Hartzog. The same document records what happened to Pigeon Forge, 8 miles north, the transformation of a crossroads hamlet into an elongated strip of tourism enterprises. A crossroads hamlet, that is what it was before. But the clearest measure of what the town did to the park is not the tramway, and it is not Pigeon Forge. It is a small thing that stopped happening, and almost nobody noticed. Beginning in 1939, the park naturalist gave public lectures in Gatlinburg, evening talks in the hotels about the mountains, the trees, the black bears, the people who had lived up there, free, for anybody who wanted to understand where they had come. They were popular enough that in 1956, when the town built the Gatlinburg Civic Auditorium, the talks moved into the bigger room, and then attendance fell off a cliff. Superintendent overly wrote down why, and it is one line, and it is perfect. With miniature golf and rides of various sorts, a definite carnival atmosphere sets in at night. In 1961, the naturalist talks were discontinued. Read that again slowly. The most visited national park in America stopped trying to explain itself to its own visitors because it could not compete with miniature golf. That is the whole story in one canceled lecture series. Everything after 1961 is the same process, running at larger and larger scale. It could have gone considerably further. In the late 1970s, 2 proposals landed in East Tennessee. The first was called Seven Peaks, a 700-acre development near Cosby, with an outdoor amphitheater seating 80,000 people and a wildlife zoo built in the shape of Noah's Ark, 200 yards long and 3 stories high. The second was Smoky World, a $100 million theme park near Townsend, attached to an 1,800-acre luxury resort with a convention center and twin 21-story residential towers. Neither was built. The Park Service objected to both, and the history is blunt that its objections had little effect on the outcome. They did not need to be built. On the 3rd of May, 1986, Dolly Parton became co-owner of a park in Pigeon Forge that had already been called Rebel Railroad, then Gold Rush Junction, then Silver Dollar City. She partnered with the Hershin family, and it was renamed Dollywood. No amphitheater for 80,000, no arc, just a name, on a park that already existed, and it did more for Pigeon Forge than either mega project would have. So here is where it stands. More than 12 million recreation visits in 2024. In 2025, it was 11,527,939, the first year under 12 million since 2018. Now you will read in a lot of places that this was a 9.9% collapse. Do the arithmetic yourself. 12,191,000 down to 11,527,000 is a fall of 663,000 people. That is 5.4%, not 9.9. And even 5.4 deserves an asterisk because a 43-day partial government shutdown closed or partly closed parks across the system in October and November of 2025. That is not a town losing its appeal. That is a closed gate. There is a longer trend, and it is real, and it also needs its context stated. Visitation peaked at 14,161,000 in 2021, down 18.6% to today. But 2021 was the pandemic. Every national park in America spiked that year because the outdoors was the only thing open. Measuring a decline from 2021 is measuring a decline from an accident. So here is the honest position, and it is the one this whole video rests on. It remains, by a distance, the most visited national park in the United States, roughly twice the second place. Whatever people mean when they say nobody wants to go to Gatlinburg anymore, they do not mean the mountains are empty. They mean something else, and the something else was built on purpose. The National Park Service puts the park's economic output at over $2.2 billion in 2023, supporting 33,748 jobs in surrounding communities. Read that phrasing again, asterisk in surrounding communities. That is not revenue to the park. The park collects camping fees, and since the 1st of March 2023, parking tags, everything else lands outside the boundary. In 2024, visitors spent $3,929,693,370 in Sevier County. $3.9 billion, up 2% on the year before. It makes Sevier the third biggest tourism county in Tennessee, behind Nashville and Memphis, and ahead of everywhere else in the state. That spending returned more than $251 million in state tax and more than $187 million in local tax. 12 million people, a gate that legally cannot charge them, and nearly $4 billion collected in the few miles of road outside it. That sentence from 1951 did not save anybody money. It moved where the money got collected. And before this turns into an easy story about greed, here is the number that complicates it. The state calculates that without the tax revenue tourism generates, every household in Sevier County would pay $11,191 more per year in state and local taxes. $11,000 a household. That is what the Strip is paying for. The pancake houses and the go-kart tracks and the 50 gift shops are not a moral failure. They are the revenue model of a county that sits at the gate of the busiest national park in America and is not permitted to charge anyone for the reason they came. On the evening of Wednesday, the 23rd of November, 2016, a fire started at the top of the Chimney Tops Trail, inside the park. 5 days later, it came out of the park. 14 people were killed, more than 200 were injured, 14,000 were evacuated. Roughly 2,500 structures were destroyed or damaged. The fire burned 11,410 acres inside the park, and around 17,000 in total once it merged with other area fires. Those are two different numbers measuring two different things, and we are giving you both. The Secretary of the Interior ordered a review. It found that preparedness and planning weaknesses hindered the park's response, and it found no evidence of negligence. The fire left the park at 8 minutes past 6 that evening. There is a second review, a separate after-action report on the firestorm itself, written by 4 investigators and published that December. It reconstructs the next 2 hours minute by minute, and it is the most important document in this story because it explains something people in Gatlinburg have been angry about ever since. The alert did not go out. At about 8 o'clock, park personnel locked the gates at the park entrance to the Gatlinburg bypass, which also blocked an evacuation route. Shortly after 8:30, the Gatlinburg fire chief ordered the entire city evacuated. At 8:40, he asked the county to have the state issue an IPAWS alert, the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System. That is the one that goes to mobile phones and to the emergency alert system at the same time. At 8:47, the state's information officer called the county to agree the wording, and here is where it comes apart. The county director handed his cell phone to Gatlinburg's information officer so she could dictate the message. When the call ended and the phone came back, he assumed it was going out. The state drafted the message. Then, as its own policy required, it tried to call back to verify the wording before broadcasting. That call never connected. The power and the cell network had gone down. At about 9 o'clock, the National Weather Service pushed an evacuation message through the emergency alert system instead. State personnel saw it, assumed the county had chosen that route, and never sent the IPAWS alert. And because it was classed as a non-weather emergency, the wireless emergency alert could not be used at all. The thing that makes every phone in a valley scream at once was not available for a fire. An IPAWS message did finally go out that night. At about 10:30, it asked everybody to stay off their cell phones. The county director did not learn for several days that the evacuation message he had requested was never broadcast. Now the counterweight because this channel does not get to leave one out. The same report says that even if that message had gone out, the communication outages at the time would have prevented or limited it from reaching anyone. There is no villain in that chain. There is a phone handed across a room, a policy that required a call back, and a cell tower that burned. Police, firefighters, and transit staff went door to door through downed lines and falling trees. The town's flood sirens built for water were sounded twice for fire. Most people were out by 10. 14 were not. Gatlinburg rebuilt, and this is where the steelman belongs, because the town deserves one. Nobody in Gatlinburg chose to sit at the gate of a park that is forbidden by law to charge admission. That was decided in a state legislature in 1951 by people who were compensating somebody else. The town simply grew into the only shape that ground allowed, and then it lost 2,500 structures in a night and built them back. What it built back was cabins. Around 2,400 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Some owners took the insurance and left. Many of the rest rebuilt, and a great number of them rebuilt as something they had not been before. Not houses, rental units. If you have driven up those ridges recently, you have seen it. Cabins in rows on switchbacks where a mountainside used to be trees. Every one of them a small business. Now, I want to be straight with you about the limits of what I can tell you here, because this is the part of the story where everybody has a strong opinion and nobody has a clean number. There is no authoritative public count of how many short-term rental units Sevier County gained after the fire. The county does not publish one. The figures that circulate, occupancy in the mid-50s, growth of about 3% a year, come from commercial market reports produced by companies selling services to cabin investors. I am not going to read you a number from a firm whose customers are the people buying the cabins. What can be said from the state's own spending data is this. Visitor spending in Sevier County has gone up every year since the fire, and in 2024, it hit its record. Whatever the rebuild was, it was not a recovery back to what existed before. It was a conversion of a place where people lived into a place where people are hosted. And that conversion is the thing the town argues about at every council meeting, and the thing you feel in the traffic on the Parkway in July. 12 million people a year drive up that road. Almost none of them know that the reason it costs nothing is that thousands of families were moved off these ridges, and that 2 states extracted a promise on their behalf that their citizens would never be charged to walk on the ground that used to be theirs. For all time, that promise is still being kept, precisely and literally. There is no booth, there is no fee. The promise was that the mountains would stay free. Nobody promised anything about the 8 miles of road you have to drive through to reach them. There is one more thing about that 1951 sentence, and it is the part that makes it a genuinely fair experiment. The park has 2 front doors. Gatlinburg sits at the Tennessee end, 40 miles across the mountains. At the North Carolina end, there is another gateway town. It got the same free park, the same 12 million people driving toward it, the same law saying nobody at the gate is allowed to charge a cent, and it did not become this. Cherokee, North Carolina is the other end of the same experiment, and what happened there is a completely different answer to the same question. That is the next one.